It's a $300 billion question. While everyone was distracted with the $61 billion in Ukraine aid, Congress was quietly making a more intriguing play. Not in the Ukraine bill, not in the Israel bill, and not in the Taiwan bill, but rather in the nebulous Omnibus Fourth bill that seemingly covered so many things that it was just easier for the media to gloss over those details. Full disclosure, I'm guilty there too. Sorry? But the question in question is the seizure of roughly $300 billion in Russian assets controlled by Western governments. It is a sensitive topic with serious implications for the war. A super scientific poll of my viewers shows a large majority of you supporting it. But whether you fall into that category or are part of the minority, and whether you call it a seizure or a confiscation or proactive reparations or a special banking operation, both camps often miss out on some of the subtleties of seizure or non-seizure. Welcome to the paradoxical world where seizure will simultaneously cause more global instability and be a force for more global stability. For those of us who have survived that logical migraine, on tap for today, we will cover exactly what those frozen assets are, what Congress's bill does to put the pile of cash into play, the issues that will pop up with how Russia might retaliate to such a seizure, what this will do to the international financial system as a whole, why the West will get a hidden benefit by downgrading the safety of foreign investments there, and we will save the best for last with some lines on maps discussion of how seizure undermines one of the West's key goals for the war. But we begin with the basics of the assets. Flashback to a decade ago, when Russia first moved into and subsequently annexed Crimea. The West responded with what, by current standards, might be best described as light sanctions. Nevertheless, it was enough to cause a notable financial crisis in Russia. Not enough to disrupt Putin's position in the Kremlin, but enough to devalue the ruble from 36 to the dollar on the date of the annexation to 61 rubles at the end of 2014. Hence the adoption of what is now called the Fortress Russia strategy. This was the Kremlin's policy aimed to build a rainy day fund of rubles, and more broadly insulate the Federation's economy from Western sanctions. The relevant consequence of this for today is that the Russian central bank built up $600 billion in savings by the time that the invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022. Oddly, about half of the money sat in Western accounts. That might seem strange given that the goal here was to insulate Moscow from foreign coercion. Nevertheless, the Western financial system is just too widespread, and it is hard to distribute $600 billion without parking quite a bit of it there. It may have been possible to move some of it out on the eve of the invasion, but remember that the Kremlin anticipated that this would be a quick operation. Kyiv's government would fall in short order, and so there would not be time for a Western sanctions campaign to matter. Side note, I know that what makes this channel unique is that I can tell you what peer-reviewed international relations research tells us about the conflicts going on in our world today. But in a bit of a reversal, I actually turned this video into a peer-reviewed article. There is a link in the video description for ungated access, and it is part of a larger symposium that I organized on the war. Lots more free reading to do, but no test later, I promise. Anyway, it is just really cool that a video with almost 6 million views now gets to become a part of the peer-reviewed record. I am not sure that this has ever happened before in any field, so thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to do this kind of thing. Now, back to the Kremlin's optimism. We all found out in short order that it was unwarranted. Consequently, the Western financial system froze the $300 billion. The money is still just sitting there. None of it has been spent, but Russia cannot access the funds. Not that we actually know where the Kremlin would go to do that. It is unclear exactly how much of it is divided between the United States and Europe. The bill that we will talk about in a moment speculates that the United States has only $4 or $5 billion of it. The vast majority instead resides in Belgium. France and Germany probably have the bulk of the remainder. However, because any further action taken on it would likely be coordinated between the sides of the Atlantic, that specific detail might not matter much. It is also unclear exactly how much money that we are looking at. It was $300 billion, but the $300 billion is not just sitting somewhere in a vault. The funds are probably accruing interest of some kind. Even a conservative investment in a one-year US Treasury bill has about a 5% rate currently. Then again, as hard as this is to remember, interest rates were close to zero at the start of the war, so we are not looking at $330 billion at this point. Regardless, it is something more than $300 billion, and this interest will become important later. That takes us to what appears in the catch-all bill that Congress passed in April. We should start with what it literally says. The key distinction is that the bill authorizes a transition from freezing the assets to seizing the assets. So instead of Russia being locked out of the accounts, transfers of the money will go into some other account. Thus, Russia will never have the opportunity to regain access to the money because it will be gone. The bill creates the following timeline. Over the first 90 days, the Treasury has to figure out exactly how much Russian money the US controls and where it is. Then, after another 90 days, the Treasury must report to Congress on its findings. 1 month after that, the president may seize, confiscate, transfer, or vest the money. That takes us to November. Biden will still be president, but within 2 months it could be Trump. Regardless, whoever is in charge will then have the power to take the Russian money and send it to Ukraine to address the damage resulting from the invasion. The bill also instructs that such measures are to be done alongside the G7, European Union, Australia, and any other parties holding Russian funds. This puts a new sense of importance on the upcoming G7 meeting, to be held in Italy from June 13th to the 15th. Now, this all sounds like upside for the West on the surface. The reality, though, is more complicated. Let's cover the main concerns and analyze just how problematic they are or they are not. First up is tit-for-tat issues from the Russian side. This has been the main thrust of the Kremlin's media response. Basically, the United States takes things, and so Russia takes things back. The difference, of course, is a significant asymmetry between the two parties. Investing Russian state assets in the West made fiscal sense. In contrast, Western states haven't exactly looked at Russia as a great place to store some dollars or euros. Thus, Uncle Sam does not have a frozen piggy bank in Moscow that the Kremlin can simply raid in response to Washington raiding Russian assets. Consequently, the retaliatory threat is for Russia to seize the private assets of American, British, or European citizens, according to former President Dmitry Medvedev. The extra layer of complication here is that when this happens, the private American citizens getting raided will undoubtedly sue the US government. Yes, Washington did not directly take their money, but there is a clear causal pathway by which the government's actions led to the loss. Now, I am not a lawyer, so I do not care to speculate on what will ultimately happen there. But I can tell you that you might get an injunction to freeze the seizure of the frozen Russian assets. Yes, that's 2 layers of ice there. And if the courts rule in favor of the private citizens, Ukraine will not get any of the money until those citizens are made whole. The whole thing turns into a complicated reallocation of assets without any benefit to anyone. The second category of problems is with future investment and the Western financial system. The United States, and to a lesser degree, the European Union, benefit from being the de facto caretakers of the world economy. This has a whole bunch of intangible benefits. But to briefly describe one, you get to borrow money denominated in your own currencies. So if you are the United States and you somehow become desperate to pay back a loan, you could always literally print the money to satisfy the payment. In contrast, imagine that you are Argentina, and you want to borrow money on the international market. Well, lenders will offer you dollars. So, you take the money. And when the loans come due, the lenders expect to receive dollars in return. Consequently, if you do not have those dollars on hand, you will have to turn to the international markets to buy dollars to pay off the debt. Actually, the fact that other countries want to borrow in dollars makes the dollar stronger, and in turn enriches the United States. Combine that with the fact that US treasuries are basically the safest investments that exist, and you end up with a system where the United States can borrow money for ridiculously low rates. That's a good thing when you have a $34 trillion national debt, and in 2023 ran a $1.7 trillion deficit. And actually, access to cheap credit is a major reason why these figures exist at all. As it relates to the seizure of Russian assets, there is a major concern here regarding other foreign governments. Ordinarily, they would want to store some money in Western institutions, but they may become worried that their assets could also be seized. Then they pull out of the US Treasury's market, and suddenly interest rates for Washington skyrocket. There is some concern that this is already happening with China. Indeed, China held just over $1 trillion in US treasuries on the eve of the invasion. Now it is down to $775 billion. To be clear, Beijing had started selling off treasuries prior to the war. This run began in 2018, with $1.2 trillion being the local maximum amount that China held. But the pace has accelerated since the tanks spilled over the border, and, overall, this would lead to a weakening of the dollar, which is bad news for the US economy. There is a good chance that you have heard some version of this argument before, but we should spend some time examining why this is not obviously a net negative for the West. Think of a spectrum of countries based on how likely they are to do dodgy things from the collective Western perspective. So on one end you have Canada, where I was once threatened to be beaten up, and then his friend interjected that they must do so politely. True story. And on the other end we have, say, North Korea. Everyone on this end does not think twice in making Western investments. Everyone on the other end is already too scared to hand over their financials. Let's mark these for later. In between is where it matters. Those marginally over here will be spooked by a Russian asset seizure and divest. Those marginally over here will not like what is happening, but they were never likely to draw the ire of the West anyway, and thus they stay in the system. So, we have 4 total groups. The question beyond the pay grade of us keyboard warriors is just how far down the line the dividing point between the 2 middle groups goes. If the split is up here, then the precedent of seizure hardly impacts the world economic structure. If the split is over here, well, that is the point where Washington needs to worry that enough of the world wants an alternative, that China will then be greatly incentivized to invest in a new system. And as a consequence, the West will lose the more moderate coercive lever of freezing assets the next time something like this happens. But there is another factor at play here. All of the discussion is on the precedent that seizure sets, and how it affects the thought process of these guys. What receives less attention is the precedent that would be set by not seizing the assets, and how it affects the thought process of these guys. Think about those middling countries that would stick with the system despite registering their complaints about US overreach. We'll use a bizarro world version of Ireland as a placeholder here, who apparently is hell-bent on dyeing America's precious waterways green. Before, when the opportunity to go rogue arose, they did not see much of a downside. Go green. But fast forward to the post-seizure world, and there is a big fat -C cost in their calculations, because their assets too will be taken. So they simply pass on going rogue in the first place, and Americans can drink safely. Thus, the Western power play loses coercive leverage over this group, but increases it over this group. I leave it to the experts to figure out which has the greater impact. Finally, we get to the main event of the evening. Get excited, because it's time for some lines on maps. Today's focus is the problem with imposing one-time costs. In other words, a cost that a country can only suffer one time and will not reset over time. Attacking a refinery is not a one-time cost, for example, because Russia can repair the damage, and then Ukraine can impose that cost once again. In contrast, asset seizure would be a one-time cost. As funny as it is to think about the Kremlin calling in to buy more treasury bills in the immediate aftermath of the West seizure, that will not happen. The basic problem is as follows. You have your standard white line to represent a hypothetical expected territorial outcome of the war if it is fought to a military conclusion. And then you have Russia's red line, with the gap between the two reflecting Russia's costs of fighting. If you want Russia to withdraw to at least the January 2022 borders as part of the final settlement of this war, then you need the red line pushed back somewhere around here. That is either accomplished by arming Ukraine to the teeth, so that the expected outcome of a war is very favorable to Kyiv, or you impose so many costs on Russia that even a favorable territorial outcome from Moscow's perspective is still a large net negative. Now, the problem with any one-time cost is that you can only impose it, well, one time. And if Western countries do that now, they cannot do it again. Moreover, it is hard to imagine that it would be possible to undo any seizing, given that the money will already be redispersed. Thus, once the seizure occurs, it is no longer a cost of war. It is just a fact of life that exists, regardless of Russia's future war and peace decisions. But that means that Russia's cost of fighting until there is a military outcome shrinks. And that means that the red line actually goes further into Ukrainian territory. As a result, for the purposes of pushing the red line back, it is better to leverage the threat of seizure than it is to actually do it, or at least not do it until after the military outcome of the war has been realized. That is the whole reason that the West froze the assets in the first place. They create bargaining leverage. Now, the cleavage between the West and Ukraine here is interesting. Ukraine is all for seizure despite the red line problem. The reason is because even if the red line moves unfavorably, Kyiv is adding a big fat $300 billion to its war outcome regardless. In that sense, the asset transfer and the line shift are a zero-sum proposition between Russia and Ukraine. One exactly cancels out the other. In contrast, compared to Ukraine, the United States places relatively more value on the war ending in any fashion, and therefore prefers having the leverage rather than acting on it. That said, there are a few ways around this problem. First, you could sell the seized assets, raise money, and then buy more weapons for Ukraine. This narrows the location of the red line because of the lost leverage, but shifts the expected outcome line back the other way, which pushes the red line along with it. The net effect is therefore nebulous. If the weapons are pivotal to the war, for example, then it is possible that the change in expected outcome more than compensates for the vanishing cost. Of course, you might want to point out here that the House bill calls for this money to go toward repairing the damage from Russia's invasion. But remember that money is fungible. That is, if more money suddenly starts flowing to humanitarian ends, then coalition partners and the Ukrainian government have more money to spend on things that go boom, and not just the finger guns. This is basically the sanctions problem, where carving out humanitarian exemptions ends up funding the target's military, but in reverse. Second, it is possible that war counterintuitively becomes easier to resolve when one party's costs are lower. My self-respecting academic alter ego has spent a lot of time researching that, and he tells the non-self-respecting version of me that the conditions for this happening are not present right now, so we might as well move on. If you really want to know how that works, then we actually did an entire video on the subject last year, but that is superfluous for right now. The last workaround is less of a solution and more of a compromise. Rather than touch the $300 billion principal, Western states will just seize the interest accrued. And again, with a T-bill generating about 5% annually right now, even a very conservative investment strategy still yields about $15 billion per year. The reason that this is not actually a solution is because, under a complete freeze, the interest would go back into Russia's account. Consequently, when interest funnels back into the principal, every year that the war continues, the effect on the red line is a small increase. $15 billion here, $15 billion here, and $15 billion here. And actually, giving the interest payments to Ukraine means that the red line decreases every year due to inflation. $300 billion just does not buy what it used to. But good news, my books on the war still cost under $300 billion. Power to the people. You can check the video description for more information on them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care. By the way, this stock photo from earlier is actually Biden getting briefed on the Wagner rebellion from almost a year ago. It's funny that the "what the flub" expression on his face is virtually identical to the one that we all had at the time.